Well, thank you for coming down to yet another sustainability dialogue. This evening we have Cindy Reul. She's voter service chair for the League of Women Voters. Very dynamic. It's been a marvelous year for voter service in the League of Women Voters. And this is not the first time she's given this presentation. I think twice before, or there'd be a mob here in the auditorium. But I was so impressed by it, I thought that she ought to do it for Sustainable Claremont. And Sustainable Claremont's purpose really has to do with sustainability, which is environmental, surely, but also social and economic. So gerrymandering fits in very nicely with that. And it's a little bit different from our usual presentation, but I'd like to turn it over to Cindy to tell us all about gerrymandering and hacking and the terrible things that can happen.
That are happening. I'd like to say it could happen, but they are happening. So this is actually an update to a report that I gave to the League in 2016, right after the presidential election. And I'd like to say that this was all new information, but mostly it's old information because nothing's changed. The only thing that has changed is we have new players in the game. So I want to start with a quote. I hope I want to start with a quote. There we go. We live in a country where the politicians or the voters no longer pick the politicians pick the voters. And I kept this quote, I attributed it to Steve Smith, who is a very vocal former Republican strategist. Many people have used this quote, but I thought it was important because Steve has been so vocal about what is going on right now. So let's get started. I am the chair of voter services. I love politics. I think it's intriguing. I love doing research, but I certainly am not a researcher. I am just a person out here trying to learn more. So let's get started. First of all, voting is a fundamental right. It is not a privilege. People say that it's a privilege to vote. It is not. It is a fundamental right for Americans. It is protected by more constitutional amendments than any other right we have, 6 of them. Freedom of speech, citizenship to all persons born or naturalized, African American men the right to vote, women the right to vote, finally poll tax abolition, and finally in 1971 we gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. The right to vote is actually the check and balance system to all of our other rights as Americans. The assault on voting in the United States takes many forms. With the electronic age and social media, identifying voter suppression is increasingly difficult for the average voter. For you and me, it's hard to figure out. There are new players and tactics. Since my report in 2016, it's gotten worse in 2018, despite the highest voter turnout in a midterm election ever. Combating voter fraud is what the battle cry is that is used to justify the new restrictions that are placed on individual voters, because that's what you are going to see by what I present today. It is much more subtle than that. Well, how did we get here? We got to go back to a little bit of history. First of all, the granddaddy of all present-day voting laws, the Voter Rights Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. What it did, in essence, it did a lot, but this is what I'm going to focus on. It eliminated discrimination by vote and language in all states. It was passed at the height of the civil rights movement, and even today is considered the most important civil rights legislation ever passed. I want you to pay attention to a couple of provisions of that law. It contains 2 special provisions that are going to be very important. Section 4 provided for a coverage formula. A coverage formula simply means that a state or a jurisdiction used some kind of method to establish whether or not you had the right to vote. The most famous of these were literacy tests. If a state historically denied the rights of its citizens to vote by using a coverage method, a coverage formula, then Section 5 came into play. And Section 5 is pre-clearance. And pre-clearance said that for any election law changes, they must be pre-approved by the Department of Justice before they could be enacted into law. This is a big deal. 9 states were under the original pre-clearance law. I can list them if you want. There's lots of lists, but you know those states. But I want to tell you the most important thing about this. When this law was passed, no state wanted to ever get on this list. They did not want their laws to be pre-approved and done by the Justice Department, so they didn't pass laws that would ever affect any kind of pre-clearance. So everybody was very reasonable for a while. Let's look at the second one, 1993, the National Voter Registration Act. This is a law signed by Bill Clinton. And what it did, believe it or not, before this time, every state could create their own individual voter registration form. They could decide where they wanted to distribute it and to what people they wanted to distribute it to. But after 1993, we came with a uniform form. So the form in California looks like the form in Alabama, looks like the form in Alaska, looks like the form in Nebraska. The only thing it says is that this is the voter registration form in Nebraska, this is the voter registration form in California, but the same formula is there. It also said under this law that we will not discriminate against who is going to get these forms. If it is a public venue, so like your Department of Motor Vehicles, social services, school boards, etc., you must be given the opportunity to get a form, and you must be given instructions on how to fill out a voter registration form. Most states put this in effect by 1995. This was the first motor voter law. California was not one of those states. Another thing this did, which again seems so logical, why are we waiting until 1995? 1995, we had to pass a law that said you could mail the form in. Before that time, you had to appear at your registrar's office and hand the form in to a clerk and then let them decide whether or not it was filled out properly. This let you mail the form in. You didn't need to show up or take time off work. And finally, look at 2002, the Help America Vote Act. HAVRA was signed by President George W. Bush. After the complications in 2000, presidential election, we all remember Florida and those hanging chads. Now this also seems incredibly logical, but it said, by law now that had to be passed, that voting equipment must be certified to perform correctly. Duh, didn't you all think that that had to happen? No, it did not. It is thought that 43 states are currently using and used in 2018 voting equipment that is past its prime, over 10 years old. 43 states in 2018 midterm elections, California was one of them. But this law also has some other interesting clauses. It said that we are going to increase the number of days and weeks that people can go and vote. They don't no longer have to show up on Tuesday. It increased the hours that polling locations could be open. It allowed for online registration. That's important. Remember, the Help America Vote Act was designed and created with bipartisan support to allow more people to have an easier time to vote. It allowed for electronic voter registration databases that were supposed to allow for an easy way for state officials to keep track of who was registering and keep those polls updated and go out to groups that were underrepresented. The Help America Vote Act was enacted by both parties. Ah, how simple life was back in 2000. Now, let's look at June 25th, 2013. This is a day that changed everything. Not everything, but it opened doors that we thought were locked forever. June 25th, 2013, the Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Holder. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, decided that, remember that coverage formula that I talked about that said a test had to be done? That was unconstitutional. And by doing that, it made Section 5 pre-clearance, where these laws had to be reviewed by the Department of Justice before they were put in effect, ineffective and unenforceable. Chief Justice Roberts wrote famously now, the current coverage system is based on a 40-year-old facts having no logical relationship to the present day. Oh yes, and by the way, Shelby County is a predominantly white county that borders Birmingham, Alabama. Since 2008, the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, and the Help America Vote Act are being slowly undermined. Remember, these laws were created to make it easier for Americans to vote, but they are making it harder for Americans to vote. They allowed for data systems for officials to help better understand what groups were participating in the voting process. And before this time, many of these groups were underrepresented. Back in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, less than 1% of African Americans living in Louisiana could vote. Let's look at what's happening now. Voter ID laws. The same day that Shelby County versus Holder passed in the Supreme Court, the state of Texas passed its first voter ID law that they had on the books ready to put in place that had been determined by the Department of Justice to be unconstitutional. They put it on the books the same day. 3 days later, North Carolina followed suit, and it's going on and on and on. We now have 35 states that require a government-issued photo identification card to vote. We say, well, what's this? What does this mean? Well, before, when the DOJ watched this, these laws were never put on the books. Now these laws are enacted, and yes, they're being challenged, but court cases take years and years and money and money. Voter ID laws unfairly affect the elderly, the youth vote, the poor and minority populations, and women. They are intended to verify that a registered voter is actually who they say they are and not some impersonator trying to cast a ballot in someone's name. Study after study after study says that is non-existent in the United States. Well, whoops, went too far, didn't I? Is this the one I want? Yes. What's the big deal? I've got an ID. You've got an ID. We've got a driver's license. I thought I always had to have a driver's license to go vote and prove who I was. You have not. Before 2006, no state required a government photo ID card to vote. All you had to do is sign your name and say, under penalty of perjury, I am who I say I am. And that allowed you the ability to vote. The first state to pass this was the state of Indiana. The Brennan Center of Justice says that 11% of American citizens do not have photo IDs. That's 21 million people do not have a photo ID. The Supreme Court upheld this first law in Indiana with a 6-3 vote. Well, let's see, how are the elderly affected? Well, the elderly affected because did you realize that 8% of people over the age of 65 no longer have a photo ID? They've given up driving. They've let their adult children handle all their finances. They don't have passports because they don't travel any longer. And they think, well, what's the big deal? Let them get a state ID card. Well, okay, let's let them get a state ID card. But if that state ID card is not kept current, if it expires over 60 days, and even though the picture of Cindy Carter Reul looks like Cindy Carter Reul, if my ID has expired over 60 days, I'll be given a provisional ballot if it's counted. I'll have to go renew all these forms before it'll be counted. It's up to the poll workers to decide if they're going to let me to vote. Now let's look at something that's really more current. Transgender voter ID laws. This time we're going to look at the liberal state of Maryland. A 22-year-old first-time voter in liberal Potomac County in Maryland showed up at the polls in November of 2018 with his driver's license that showed his gender as female. Gender is not a requirement to vote in the state of Maryland, and he knew this. By the poll workers, he was asked to stand aside while the poll workers continued to check in other voters, talked about his issue publicly. He was finally allowed to vote after an hour of going through this. He has said that he will no longer go to the polls to vote because he was humiliated. He's decided in the future he's going to vote absentee. He said the polls were just too anxiety-provoking. Here's the statistics. 32% of transgender voters say that voting is a negative experience for them. 25% are verbally harassed at the polls. 9% are asked to leave the polls, and when they do leave, 2% of them are physically assaulted. 8 states now require a gender match to vote, and more are joining this. Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Virginia, and Wisconsin. In the 2018 midterms, it's estimated that approximately 78,000 transgender voters in these 8 states may have faced harassment. Here's another new law. This one was just passed July 12th, 2018 in New Hampshire. You remember that's the state with the first presidential primary. New Hampshire has decided that all registered voters in the state of New Hampshire must provide proof of residency. This requires that everyone who enters the state of New Hampshire within 60 days of taking residency must change their driver's license or voter or ID card to New Hampshire. They must also register their vehicle in the state of New Hampshire. If they don't do that within 60 days, they face fines or they give up their voting. This is primarily aimed at the youth vote. Before this time, students could go to school in New Hampshire and decide, hey, I think there's an issue in New Hampshire I want to vote for, and vote. Or, hey, no, my home state's California, I want to vote absentee out of California. Before this time, all they had to do is say that they spent most of their time in the state of New Hampshire in order to vote. That is no longer the case. Students now must get these IDs, and New Hampshire also has some of the highest voter registration, car registration fees in the nation. But don't call this a poll tax, because it's not a poll tax requiring all this money up front to get your card to vote in New Hampshire. No, no, no. The people in New Hampshire just want to make sure you really, really care about New Hampshire to vote there. The law was challenged. The New Hampshire Supreme Court upheld it in a 6-3 decision. It will be in effect in 2020 presidential election unless it is changed by the legislature that was just recently voted in the 2018 election. But beware, many of these other states that have student populations are rushing to put the same type of laws on their books before 2020, thus making it difficult for the youth vote. And if you know how the youth vote works, the youth vote always moves the needle. Always moves the needle. So if we can stop them from voting, the needle's going to stay the same. Now let's look at North Dakota. North Dakota residents now must show a physical address on their driver's license. Before this time, you could have a P.O. box, and that was acceptable. Many people in North Dakota live on rural roads that do not have physical street addresses. They live on Rural Road 1, Box 3, 3 houses down from my neighbor Jones, and that was acceptable in the past. This law is primarily aimed at the Native American population. Native American tribes live on rural roads and on reservations. They do not have numbered street addresses on the reservation. Before this law passed, all a Native American needed to do, show up with his P.O. box and have his voter poll worker say, oh, hi, Joe, it's nice to see you. I'm glad you're making it back after 42 years that I've recognized you. Or they could sign an affidavit. Not any longer. Without a physical address, they will not be allowed to vote. The United States Supreme Court upheld this law by a 5-4 decision. And again, before 2020, states with large Native American populations are rushing to put these on the books before 2020. Now let's look at name and address match. This one primarily affects women. Many states now require an exact address on your name and address on your driver's license or ID to match what is on your voter registration form. Well, I registered when I was 21. My name was Cynthia Lucille Carter. My name now on my marriage license says Cynthia Lucille Carter Reul. My name on my voter rolls says Cynthia Carter Reul. Oh, I would be allowed to vote in some of these states provisionally. They wouldn't accept me just to go in the polls, provisionally. But then what's required for me? I have 3 to 7 days after the election to gather up all my forms, take them not to my polling place, but to the registrar's office, 3 to 7 days to get all those forms to match, and then they will count my ballot. Otherwise, will not be counted my provisional ballot. 3 to 7 days. Let's talk about Alabama, because Alabama's a fun state. They don't require a driver's license. They require a separate photo voter identification card. And what they did was decide that maybe people were going to go out and get this card, and they found out that maybe if we eliminated and closed our Department of Motor Vehicle offices in rural minority counties, maybe that wouldn't happen. And that's exactly what did happen. They closed them in primarily African American counties, thus making it difficult to get this separate ID card from your driver's license. Again, this was challenged in the court, and lo and behold, we love Alabama. They came up with a fantastic remedy. You know what you can do in Alabama now? And this is legal. They have one mobile motor home that is their mobile office for their DMV work and their voter ID cards that drives all over the state. And hopefully you're in the right place at the right time when they're driving through your town so you can get your voter ID card. Again, upheld, and that was the remedy that was accepted by the courts. Let's look at another thing that's recently happened. Early voting. For more than 2 decades, states have increasing their early voting opportunities. Remember, that's what the 2002 did. Let's give them more time to vote and not make everybody take time off on Tuesday. It works. More people vote. People like it. It makes the whole system work better. It's smooth. Election officials like it. In fact, most states now allow early voting. So what happened in 2018? Early voting surged. Nearly 36 million people voted early. So why are some states curtailing this? Well, let's remember those voter databases. They tell us who's voting, when they're voting, where they live. They don't tell us how they vote, just we can make statistical analysis and make assumptions about that. So what happened was African Americans began early voting in high numbers beginning back in 2008. In the southern states, early voting by African Americans exceeded white voters by a large margin. Why? Simply because they didn't have to take time off work to go vote. 8 states have now reduced their early voting days and hours. Almost all have eliminated early Sunday voting. Again, because African Americans go to church on Sunday, they get on the church bus, they would go to the polling place and vote. So we're not going to have that. We're not going to have that. 8 states now. Polling hours, they've been cut. And polling hours have been cut. Again, we got to save money. Elections are expensive. That's how they justify all these things. Cost money, we got to save money. Problem is they pick and choose where they're going to do this. So they've cut polling hours primarily in large urban communities. So that makes people that are working, again, large minority populations, you might not get off of work until 5 o'clock. Now you got a long line around the building because the polling place is closing at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, not 8 o'clock like it had been a couple of years ago. And you know, I know what you are all thinking, and I understand this. Why do these people put up with this abuse? Just get an absentee ballot. Well, there is a reason why in California we call it a vote by mail ballot and not an absentee ballot. Because in California, you don't have to have a reason why you're not at your polling place. In these other states that require absentee ballots, you have to fill out a form and you have to have a reason why you can't be at your Tuesday polling place. And then they'll give you an absentee ballot, but that will only apply in many of these states for only one election cycle, and you must reapply, reapply, reapply. And that's what happened in North Carolina, which we will get to many times tonight on what happens in North Carolina. All right, now, moving on. Let's look at some of these old school practices, and these are ones that I talked about in 2016 report. None of them have changed. They're all illegal, but they're all effective. Elimination of polling locations, again, to save taxpayer money, and they creating voting centers instead. California is doing that, but there is a difference. California is doing it to encourage us to vote. They are giving us more hours. They are going to be hiring people that actually know the laws. They're going to have same-day voting. There are lots of positives that are going to happen because of California voting centers. In these other states, they use those voting centers as an excuse to close those local stations. Overzealous voter purges. This is a fun one. Elimination of voters from the rolls. This is primarily used to cut common names from the poll booth. from the poll books. The justification is, again, that the same person may be crossing those lines and voting after multiple times, so that we can't have that. So what we found is the United States Census data shows that of the 100 most common last names, 85 of those are predominantly minority groups. For example, if your last name is Washington, there's an 89% chance you are African American. Hernandez, 94% chance you're Hispanic. Kim, 95% chance that you are Asian. Most of these people are notified by a postcard. It looks official, but I don't know how many postcards you throw away. I throw away a lot of junk mail and don't look at it. And you're being inundated with this stuff. You're usually given 2 weeks to respond. If you don't respond again, at your polling, not at your polling place, at your registrar's office with the proper documents, you're taken off the rolls, and you won't even know until you show up at the polling place. They don't send you a notification that says, Joe Hernandez, you've been now removed from the books. You better get your stuff. No, Joe Hernandez shows up at the poll where he's been going for 40 years, and he finds out his name is not there. Again, they'll let him vote provisionally, but he's got 3 to 7 days to fix it. Elimination of restrictions on organized voter registration drives. This is also a fun one. This is what the league does. This is what the NAACP does. This is what Rock the Vote does. We go out and organize events so that we can register underserved communities. Well, some states have now decided that, well, maybe we need to only have officials do that. So they have eliminated the ability for the league to do that or made the league pay fees to do this. What happened in Florida in 2016? Before the 2016 presidential election in Florida, we had been registering people like we had been all along. Florida legislature passed a law that said, that's fine, legal women voters, you go out and register for people, but you must have that registration form that's completed returned to the Secretary of State's office within 72 hours. If you do not, we are going to charge you a fine of up to $2,000 per registration form. So, Rock the Vote, League of Women Voters, MoveOn.org, NAACP, Vote Latino, all decided we could not afford to risk those $2,000 fines. So what we had to do, we had to sue. And we won. But it took us 2 years. So for 2 years, none of these groups registered anyone in the state of Florida. I am happy to tell you we are registering people in Florida now. But these restrictions are being put on by other states to just make it only certain days, certain hours. You got to have this much schooling. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to jump over this hoop. It's happening. Last minute changes in the polling locations. An official actually has the legal right to change your polling place at the last minute. Well, in Texas, back in 2016, they closed 400 of their polling places. Went to court. Court said, no, you got to open these back up. So they did. Texas opened up those 400 closed locations, again, predominantly in minority communities. So Texas thought, gee, what can we do next? How can we fix this? How can we do it? So they came up on an interesting adaptation of a wonderful law that they corrupted. They found that some of these polling places were not ADA compliant. Bathrooms were not American with Disabilities compliant. They closed them down. They moved the polling places in some cases where they found an ADA compliant polling place up to 40 miles away. 40 miles one way away. And this happened days before the elections. Days before the election. Phone jamming. We all get robocalls, don't we? And we hate them. Well, these are robocalls specifically brought on by the other party to create misleading information to voters. So I'll call up Betsy and say, hey, Betsy, you don't need to go vote. Our candidate's in. You can stay home and watch American Idol. Don't go vote. Or, you know what? Your polling place changed. It's not at the school anymore. It's over up north, and I don't know if you can get there in time, if you can get there in time. You want me to come and get you? What's your address? Oh, darn it, I couldn't find you. Couldn't find you. Or maybe, the election's not Tuesday. It was last Tuesday. You missed it. Misinformation that comes in the mail is a lot like phone jamming, only now you've received it in the mail. Same thing, official looking document. New address for your polling place. new names misspelled on who to vote for, misinformation about the candidates that are running. These things are illegal, but they are difficult to prove. It's hard to prove who made that phone call, that robocall to you. It's hard to prove that, oh my gosh, that was misinformation. The printer must have did it when I sent it out to you. I had great intentions of giving you the right information so that you could vote. Now let's talk about voter harassment. And this is intimidation outside the polls, primarily in open carry states. And these are not just one guy in his 10-gallon hat with his 6-gun strapped to his side. They are usually groups of large men with their guns on their hips, walking up and down the polling lines while people are waiting. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was one a little 18-year-old voting for the first time and I'm a 65-year-old woman, that would intimidate me. Polling place observers is another tactic. The league loves polling place observers. We provide polling place observers. Those are people we put in the polling rooms so that we can make sure people are being treated equally and equitably and fair and the system is working. But that's not what this is. This is me coming down the aisle while you're waiting in line. This is not your neighborhood. You don't vote here. You go down the street. This is not your polling place. You don't belong here. That's what they do. Illegal, catching them, prosecuting when people are intimidated and scared, and especially in today's environment, that is difficult. Now, you think I've given you enough to think about. Here we go to the newbies. Misleading advertisement, shadow banning, and astroturfing. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google, you know the drill. With the advent of social media, the ability for a bad player to influence our election is problematic, to put it mildly. It's difficult for anyone to know that the information that you receive is legitimate. You must pay very close attention to stories, ads, influencers, your family and friends when they're forwarding something. Is it truthful? Does it make sense? Do these ads that just pop up, do they make sense? You have to do your due diligence, and I'm going to give you a list of respected, independent fact-checking organizations in just a minute. But before I go to that, let's go to misleading advertisement. False advertising. Consumers have been protected for products for false advertising for years by truth in advertising laws. Shouldn't voters be as protected as well? The fact is, no. Candidates have a legal right to lie to you, and they do. The First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech, and that applies to candidates as well. The few states that have tried to enact these laws to protect voters of false ads have not been very successful. They've been overturned in the courts. In fact, the Federal Communications Act requires that broadcasters must run an unabridged ad, an uncensored ad, even if the broadcasters believe the ad content to be offensive or false. Remember the Swift boating ad? If they take down one of those ads, they have to take them down for all candidates. It's an all or nothing game. There's no choice in this. In the case of Facebook, a post can be forwarded so fast with just a click, and a like will get more likes and more language that it's the same political ideology that was posted the first place before they even have an opportunity to take it down. Freedom of speech means that we've got to accept speech that we don't like as well as speech that we do like. And here's a list of respected organizations that do fact-checking, independent. PolitiFact, am I too far? Yeah, this one. PolitiFact, factcheck.org, Washington Post, you know, the little Pinocchios, Snopes, New York Times, and the Weekly Standard. These are all good, independent places to check everything. Now let's change this up. I want you to do a little quiz for me. I don't want you to raise your hand or make any decision. Just look at these two ads that are posted on Facebook. Tell me which ad you believe, not tell me, think about which one you think is false and think about it to yourself. I'm going to give you a second. Most of you got an idea about what you think? All right. The post on the right is from a site called Black Elevation. It is a fake site. Black Elevation was one of the largest Facebook pages on Facebook that was shut down at the end of July of 2018. By the time it was shut down, it had nearly 140,000 followers. This group targeted activists fighting for racial equality in the United States. The page tried to mimic Black Lives Matter to create division among Americans. This is a well-known strategy among Russian influence operation. Hundreds of Facebook ads were bought by Russian trolls, clearly meant to incite racial tension in the United States. This page's most notable activity is they actually organized demonstrations. They organized demonstrations across the country in large cities. And when it came time to pull the license, they said, oh, you know what, League of Women Voters, I can't get down there to fill out the paperwork. So they sucked in groups like League of Women Voters, NAACP, Real Black Lives Matter, to become the sponsor of these ads or these movements that they falsely put out there. The New York Times asked for, after the 2018 midterm elections, for their subscribers to send them examples of false advertisement that they received. They received over 4,000 examples. Shadow banning. Shadow banning has been kind of in the news because of Devin Nunes. But what shadow banning is shadow banning is someone with a Twitter account or an Instagram or whatever who makes a post that is so egregious, so hateful, that that individual post is believed by someone. If I write Cindy Reul is a beautiful woman, obviously that is an egregious, hateful statement, so that needs to be blocked. But I believe that all of you are getting that post, which you're not. But that doesn't mean every post that I put out is out there. It doesn't mean they've looked at my political party or my affiliations. It just means someone has put out something that they decide is so egregious, so hateful, we are going to take down this one site, even though that person believes that that site is still there. That's all it is. Tech companies like Facebook, Twitter have wrestled to try to figure out what to do to combat the internet trolls that are out there and still allow First Amendment rights. They're still working at it. They're not very good at it, and they're not getting any leadership from our government. This is my favorite, astroturfing. Astroturfing is the practice of masking sponsors of a message or an organization to make it appear as if it originates and is supported by a grassroots participant. It disguises itself as spontaneous, authentic, popular movements. It is fake grassroots. Isn't that a great term, astroturfing? Fake grass, astroturfing. Here's some examples. Let's look at that. Isn't that a great logo, Save Our Tips? Doesn't that sound like those guys are out there, those poor workers that are waiters, save my tips? The real sponsors behind this are anti-minimum wage groups, restaurant owners. The second one, the National Wetlands Coalition. That's a great logo, and I bet most of you would want to log on to that one. And you would think that that is a great company because I like wetlands, and what this company or what this group is proposing is that we have more access to these beautiful places for more Americans. I want more access to these places. I think that's a good idea. Well, who they are? Oil companies and real estate companies. Astroturfing, yes. Well, sorry. You know what they did, because that is just a drag. You're right, thank you. There are spelling errors in it. Oh, thank you very much. Astroturfing is a real problem. The companies that do this are protected because they run their money through nonprofits and they never have to disclose it. There is total anonymity. It happens all the time, all the time. What else they do? They provide paid protesters, they provide paid demonstrators, they provide paid audience members. They show up to protest at city council meetings, to disrupt your public comment at city council meetings. They are given talking points by the companies that pay them. They don't tell you they're being paid. The most well-known of these companies is this Crowds on Demand. Crowds on Demand's founder says, you know what, I'm providing a public service. More people are involved in democracy because of what I do. Look at them. You're home for the protest, rallies, advocacy, audiences, PR stunts, political events. They go and hire people all over the country. Not cheating, they're providing a service. They're providing a service. Here's what astroturfers also do. They provide fake expert witnesses that are paid by shadow groups to appear as expert witnesses before committees, legislatures, local city councils, Senate groups, everywhere. That's Citizens for Fire Safety. An expert appeared in the California legislature. He is a representative, he is a doctor for the Citizens for Fire Safety. I am a Californian, I want fire safety, I think all of us do. Well, this was about a bill that the legislature was going to pass that wanted to ban the use of fire retardant chemicals in clothing and furniture, etc., because there was a link to cancer. He stated when he appeared before the legislature that he did not represent any of the fire retardant companies. And he's absolutely right. He represented Citizens for Fire Safety. The only 3 members of Citizens for Fire Safety are the 3 fire retardant chemical companies. He went on to explain in 3 different legislatures, California, Washington, and I believe the third one was Alaska. And this is what he said. And I do not diminish anyone who has had a tragedy in their life. So please do understand, I am not trying to diminish them. He appeared as a doctor, as an expert witness before the California legislature, as a representative of Citizens for Fire Safety. And he said, I have a story to tell you. A horrific story to tell you. There is a baby on the crib with its fire retardant sheets and its fire retardant blanket, but did not have a fire retardant pillow. The mother had a lit candle in the room by the baby's crib, and the mother left the room. And no one knows how it happened, but that candle fell in the bed. That baby was burned over 80% of its body. I had to treat that baby while it suffered for the last 2 weeks of its life. Well, a reporter, as he repeated this story, like I said, in the 3 different legislatures, he actually got California to postpone their law. They did eventually pass it. A reporter went in and said he looked through everything to try to find this. And it's a horrific story. It would have made the news. Horrific story. No story. When he confronted the doctor said, oh, well, you know what? It was just anecdotal, and I wasn't under oath. He was paid $250,000. With the spread of social media threads, astroturfing is effective. It creates uncertainty and lowers trust among all of us. Now let's go on to hacking. Having fun yet? All right, here we go. Hacking. Remember I told you those 43 states that were voting on machines that were outdated? Well, they're voting on machines that are not even manufactured anymore. This leaves them vulnerable to hacking. Well, who's hacking? Yeah, the Russians, but the Chinese, the Iranians, and even that 400-pound guy sitting on his bed in his bedroom, he can hack. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what our intelligence groups have found out and what we're trying to do about it before 2020. We didn't do much before the midterms, and we aren't doing much either now. 2018 was the first election that there was widespread awareness that the Russians were doing something, that there was foreign hacking or the potential of foreign hacking of our election systems. In 2016, Russian agents manipulated through social media and false advertising, remember astroturfing, and attempted to interfere with many of our voting systems. They've only gotten better at it. Russian influence alone reached an estimated 126 million Americans on Facebook only. These groups divided us by race, religion, gun rights, gay transgender law issues, women's rights, night or day. They don't care. The goal is division and chaos. That is the goal, just division. Twitter identified 2,700 fake accounts, Google had 1,100 fake videos posted. The good news? There's a little bit. 33 states have mandated that they must replace their equipment by 2020, but most of them do not have the money to do so. Remember, states fund their own elections, and even counties fund their own elections beyond that. The other problem is no manufacturer wants to produce these machines because who wants to put a public liability suit out on yourself, on a product liability suit if your machine is hacked? So very few people are producing them. There's very little work done, In LA County, we actually have found someone to produce a machine that we'll be using in 2020 in LA County that was developed by LA County, specifically being built only for LA County at the present time. Well, let's talk about this. Paper ballots, it's 2019. Who needs a stupid paper ballot? Well, let's talk about that. 13 states use direct recording electronic voting machines. There is no paper backup. There is no way to even tell if the votes have all been counted. There is no auditing system in these 13 states to do anything to double check that. And they've been using these systems for years. And they're still using them. Only one state in 2018, Colorado, actually passed a law that said we're going to do an audit of our 2018 elections. And what Colorado decided to do, the only state, they decided to take a random statistical amount of their paper ballots, manually count them, and match them up to what was actually being posted to make sure that those things match. And if there was a statistical variance, they were mandated by law to go and manually count 100% of their paper ballots. Luckily, that couldn't happen, and can you imagine? But at least they did something. At least they did something. As of June of 2017, 41 of these, I've been using 43, but now 41 states are using online voter registration databases that were developed over 10 years ago. Those systems are not equipped to handle any of the cyber threats that are out there nowadays. They're still using them. They're trying to fix them. We hope. Unless significant steps are taken to bolster the security of our election infrastructure, there's a serious, serious risk to successful attacks on our election going forward. Not only 2020, but going forward. Attacks by cyber criminals or nation states could take down election websites, they could change polling places, they could change voter registration statuses, they can even change unofficial voter results. They can change the computer software. It's the Secretary of States who run the elections. There are 50 of them. Every state has the laws for its own state on how elections are run. Well, they have a little club that they all belong to, and they know there's a problem. So they decided to take their decommissioned voting machines and take their websites and submitted to the world's largest hacking conference, DEF CON, to test their own cybersecurity. An 11-year-old girl changed the results of the presidential election in Florida on the Secretary of State's website in 2016, taking off President Trump and electing the Libertarian candidate in the state of Florida on the Secretary of websites. It took her 10 minutes. She didn't change any votes. She didn't change anything. She changed what officially was out there on the Secretary of State's website. Clearly, we've got problems. Clearly, we've got problems. Let's look at some progress. There's some. At the federal election level, Congress appropriated $380 million to help states upgrade their voting systems. This is the first money from the federal government since 2002, when George W. Bush said we got to fix this system. No money was ever given to the states to do that. 2002, no money. We finally got $380 million, a drop in the bucket, but it's something. It came too late for 2018. The money has not been distributed widely yet. We hope that it will be. At least 17 states and more are happening every day that have requested the Department of Homeland Security to conduct a risk assessment of their systems, and the Department of Homeland Security should be able to identify ways that they can fix them and best practices for securing the elections. The United States Election Assistance Commission has provided cybersecurity training to many hundreds of state and local election officials, and more are signing up every day for this training. Homeland Security, state and local officials have established a coordinating council to allow them to share threat information. So if Illinois sees something, which we know Illinois was successfully hacked, as well as we now know, according to Mueller, that a county in Florida was successfully hacked, they will now be able to find out about this, pool their resources and pool their response to get something out for every state to say, everybody, look at this. This is what's happening. So hopefully they're going to be prepared to do that in 2020. 26 states right now have pending legislation to improve their election security, but all of those bills are still stuck. They've not moved forward for final approval. What can be done? The very least that should be done, the very least, is every state should have a post-election audit established so that they can verify what they are putting out matches to what's happening. States should have a detailed contingency plan in place in case there is a security breach. That's the very minimum they can do. Very few states are that far in the game. And the reason they aren't that far in the game is because there is no federal direction. States can't do this on their own. 50 states have 50 different ideas. There needs to be direction. Now let's move on to gerrymandering. We're getting there. Gerrymandering is simply the use of manipulating borders to create boundaries that affect one party over another party or one class over another class. I'm not going to review to you how many states are involved in what's called extreme gerrymandering. I'm going to talk about the 2 cases that are currently before the Supreme Court. But before we go into those 2 cases, I want to remind you that since the census in 2012, we've had those data systems that make it easy to tell who is voting. They tell us who voted, when they voted, where they voted. Census data also tells us their income level, education level, their ethnicity, and even their names. This is public information. This is the data that has now made gerrymandering what is called extreme. Gerrymandering has been around since Andrew Jackson. Political gerrymandering has been around as well as racial. 2 types, racial and political. Cases brought against racial gerrymandering are easy for the Supreme Court and the lower courts to decide because there is existing law. The Voter Rights Act of 1965, several articles of the Constitution make it very clear that this is illegal. So it's easy for the courts to decide this. So they've been able to do that. But political gerrymandering cases are much more difficult because there is no established law. That's why they keep punting it down. These 2 cases are the same 2 cases that were in front of the Supreme Court in 2016. But the Supreme Court punted them back to the lower courts because they decided in 2016 that standing had not been established. What standing is means that the plaintiff who brings the suit has been harmed and has a legal right to bring the cases forward. The Supreme Court decided neither one of these cases proved standing. They're going back to the lower courts. Back in 2017, the lower courts did establish standing, and they moved back up to the Supreme Court where they are right now. Standing, remember, is not about issues. It is strictly a legal thing that says you have a right to bring a lawsuit. The outcomes of these 2 cases will have a profound effect on elections that go forward. We have a census coming up in a year, and remember, when these district maps are drawn, they are in place for 10 years until the next census. We get 1 chance to get it right. It will depend on these 2 cases and the decisions by the Supreme Court. These arguments were heard in front of the Supreme Court again back on March 26, 2019. And a ruling is expected any day. In fact, I checked my phone before I came in here to make sure there was no ruling, because it's that close. We are that close. And remember, again, the maps will be drawn in 2021, be in effect through all the elections through 2030. Now let's take a look at Rousseau versus Common Cause. In 2016, this same case was titled Rousseau versus the League of Women Voters. The reason the name change is simply for legal scholars to know that, the 2016 arguments I look up under League of Women Voters. The 2018 arguments I look under Common Cause. We were the same groups, we're still fighting the same case. The case comes from North Carolina. The first thing you need to know about North Carolina, one of many, but when North Carolina drew their maps back in 2016, they were thrown out because of racial gerrymandering. The state said, no, this is, the Supreme Court said this is racial gerrymandering. It's very clear. There were emails to back it up. They weren't even smart about it. Threw it out. So Mr. Rousseau, Robert Rousseau, who is the chairman of the redistricting committee in the state of North Carolina, redrew the maps in February of 2016. He was required to do that. So he did that. Those maps were approved now. The new maps were approved by the legislature. But again, now we are fighting them on political gerrymandering. So the North Carolina Supreme Court, on January 9th of 2018 said these new maps are extreme political gerrymandering, and we're not going to let you do that either. But 5 days later, the state of New Hampshire, their legislature, did an emergency filing to the application to the United States Supreme Court because they said, you know what, we can't possibly redraw these lines before the 2018 November elections. So those were in effect in the November 2018 midterms elections, those maps that have been determined to be by the courts unconstitutional, by the North Carolina court. Well, what happened in North Carolina? Well, in North Carolina in 2018, in November, the Democratic Party received the majority of the state votes. They elected a Democratic governor. However, because of the gerrymandering, the Republican Party still holds 9 Republican seats to 3 Democratic seats in the legislature. There is 1 seat still open, which we'll still get to. They also used what's a very common method, that's something that's called packing and cracking when they drew these lines. They took a predominantly historically black college called Caesars College in Greensboro, North Carolina. They divided that college down the middle. So it was in 2 districts, 2 Republican-leaning districts. By splitting that vote, they re-elected 2 Republicans as they had been before. Had that college been able to go into a single district, the outcome looks like it probably would have been different. We might have had 1 from each political party. We don't know that for sure. But we know whenever they get worried, they do something with the youth vote. The youth vote moves the needle. All right, let's look at the next one. Lemone versus Ben Asec. This one is brought by Republicans in the liberal state of Maryland. This case was brought by Republican voters. There are 7 of them. Mr. Ben Asec is one of the Republican voters who say that the Democratic election officials, Linda Lemone, who's head of Maryland State Democratic Elections, Board of Elections, targeted unfairly Republicans when they drew the maps in 2014 in District 6. Those new maps diluted the Republican vote. They moved 65,000 Republican voters out of a traditionally Republican district and added 30,000 Democrat voters. That district had been represented by Republican Roscoe Bartlett for 20 years before the maps were redrawn, and the election happened in 2012 when, for the first time, a Democrat, John Delaney, was elected in that district. He still currently serves in that district because the maps have not been changed. Again, both of these cases were back there in 2016. They're both brought forward because a standing has been established. They both were heard in front of the Supreme Court consecutively on the same day, March 26th. In the Supreme Court, when you bring an argument, you only have 45 minutes to defend your side. It's very concise, it's very quick. They move it along, they ask questions, and they're very precise on this. So, why have I picked on Justice Brett Kavanaugh? I'm a nutcase, as you can tell by all of this. I read most of the transcripts of the Supreme Court arguments for both of these cases. I found them fascinating. 84 pages on one, 74 pages on the other one. Well, what was interesting about this was Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh asked very detailed questions. He is very familiar with the cases. He was not on the Supreme Court when they were first heard in 2016. He is on the bench now and can hear them. The Maryland case, Maryland is his home state, so he was very, very familiar with that case. He said in the Supreme Court, extreme gerrymandering is a real problem for a democracy, and I'm not going to dispute that. However, he added that recent developments around the nation, primarily state ballot initiatives establishing independent redistricting commissions, may make any action by the Supreme Court premature and unnecessary. By reading all these transcripts, you can't figure out how it's going to go. It's going to come down before June 30th, we know, unless they figure out a way to punt it back and not do anything with it again. And Brett Kavanaugh is right. There are more independent commissions. In 2018, 5 more states joined the existing 6 states and voted for, through ballot initiatives, independent redistricting commissions. Most states, redistricting is done by the state legislatures. So those states now include Colorado, Michigan, Missouri, Utah, and Ohio, and they joined Alaska, Arizona, California, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. Mostly western states, no eastern states. And what has happened? A couple of things. Arizona actually passed their law in 1993. They were very progressive on thinking about independent commissions. But now the Arizona legislature is actually in the process of trying to overturn that and go back to having them drawn by the legislature. Utah just passed that initiative overwhelmingly. The Utah legislature is now in the process of trying to overturn the people's will and go back to the legislature as well. We don't know what's going to happen. All right, now let's look at something that's kind of confusing. Voter fraud versus election fraud. They are not the same thing, even though groups would have you believe that they are. Voter fraud is the individual corruption by an individual voter. Sell their vote, use a fake ID, one vote, and what it does is it defeats the principle of one person, one vote. Study after study after study shows this is non-existent. Any organized individual voter fraud is non-existent in the United States. There have been cases, small cases, where some judicial candidates have paid 9 or 10 voters to vote for a judge. But that's the biggest thing we've ever found, 9 or 10. There's no massive 3 million illegal voters voting. However, election fraud, that's a different ballgame. Election fraud is the illegal interference in the process of an election by either increasing the vote share of a favored candidate or depressing the vote share of a rival candidate. The key difference is important. In voter fraud, it's the voter perpetrating the fraud. In election fraud, it is the fraud being perpetrated upon the voters. Election fraud is what happened in the 9th District. We're back to North Carolina. Remember, in North Carolina, there was systematic gathering of those absentee ballots. How did it happen? There was a list, a public list on who took an absentee ballot out in 2016. So this group went around, got that list, and went on, knocked on doors, knock, knock, knock. Freeman, I'm going to help you fill out the form so you can get your 2018 absentee ballot. Let me help you with that. Filled it out for him, got his election ballot. I'll even deliver it for you, Freeman, and I'm going to come back and help you with it and pick it up. That's what they did. They helped gather the ballots. They helped distribute the ballots. They went and gathered up those ballots. They forged signatures. They tossed them in the trash, and thank goodness they were caught. It was proven that they did this. The Secretary of State refused to sign off on that one election, the 9th District in North Carolina. North Carolina 9th District just held their primary last month. The seat is still open. They will be having the general election with 2 candidates to fill that in September. But they were caught. Now remember the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. It's been disbanded. Not one single member of that commission has said one single word about what really happened, election fraud, not voter fraud. They've been totally silent about the election fraud in North Carolina. Totally. All right, fake news. Finally, 2020 is fast approaching. What are we going to do? Will fake news play a part? And I'm not talking about CNN, MSNBC, or even Fox. I'm talking about the big social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, they're all working to try to control their sites. They admit they were unprepared for 2016. They don't know what to do about it now, no direction. But I want you to know that that misinformation doesn't usually start on those platforms. It starts on the dark web, and then it starts getting forwarded and gaining strength and goes viral, then hops over to these other social medias. The mainstream media gathers steam, goes viral, and then hops over to our mainstream media, which is in a competitive business, profitable competitive business, and maybe they aren't checking their sources, so maybe they're putting out information that's not correct. What can be done? Well, Benjamin Decker of Politico, he's got an idea. He's got an idea that he says that a cross-platform hub in which independent researchers and journalists, as well as the security teams of the major social outlets, work together to inform each other of emerging threats. And they can do this by searching through their hashtags, memes, videos, and websites. For example, they can keep track of soft spikes before they go viral and get big. And then they could be prepared to counter it, whether it's through fact-checking, down-ranking, or removing the content altogether. There is precedent for this. There is established laws regulating social media that fight explicitly illegal internet content, child pornography, terrorism. So there is established law that they could use to enact this to protect us voters. Whether they will or not, we don't know. We are finally, believe it or not, at the end. So much is happening, I had to actually stop myself from updating this report. I had so much information, I had to throw everything out before 2018 because I couldn't keep track of it. So I had to accumulate it from then. And like I said, I just checked my phone before I came in to make sure nothing else has happened that I needed to talk about. You need to know that we are responsible for this. We need to act. And right now, no one is acting, no one cares. You need to know that organizations like the League of Women Voters, we are out there trying to do our best to stop this. When laws are passed, we are on the forefront, along with other organizations, fighting back in the court systems to get these things overturned so that more Americans can vote, which is the democratic way, which we all believe in. Costs money, it takes time. Costs money and takes time. And I want to leave you finally, before we get to the questions, I want to leave you with a quote by Bob Mueller on May 29th. There were multiple systematic efforts to interfere in our elections, and that effort deserves the attention of every American. And I hope by presenting this today, I have not only shown you the external effects that are happening to our country, but many internal effects that are also happening in our country. Questions?
Thank you, Cindy. That was really very impressive.
Thank you.
Now, for the question part, in order to have our recording understandable, I'd like you to use the microphone, and Jen Pizzolo will be taking the microphone around. If you'll raise your hand if you have a question.
And I want to leave you also with a list of my sources. Primarily, most of my sources came from the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. About 85% of it, but the rest of it came from all of these others, and I'm sure I did leave some out. And there are many things that I didn't even get to cover. H.R. 1, H.R. 4, the Electoral College, the Florida legislature passed Amendment 4, the felons' right to vote. They're trying to overturn that. That was passed overwhelmingly. There's so much I haven't covered. The citizenship, the census, the national popular vote movement, there's many things that I didn't even get to. So I will be happy to take anyone's questions if I can answer them.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm just curious about gerrymandering and what criteria would you use or is being used to determine whether either a change in boundary is appropriate or whether existing boundaries are appropriate?
The main thing that seems to be the most independent is a system of counting votes mathematically using votes, the total number of votes, and taking the number of votes of the losing party and comparing the difference between those and seeing if the losing votes were diluted in any systematic method. It's pretty easy, and I believe, and I could have, it's one of the M states, I think it's Michigan, is actually voted to try it. And is it Michigan? Do you know that for sure? Okay, to try that in 2020. And did I explain that properly?
Yeah, so basically there's like a methodological tool that they have that, so there's a methodological tool, just a statistical tool that's like fairly simple,
Yeah.
that measures the difference between the vote total and the representation that hopefully the Supreme Court's going to look at to determine whether or not, there's whether or not that discrepancy is too high. And so I think it was Michigan that's going to try that, but I think that there's hope that the Supreme Court will see this as a way that they won't have to make a decision on a case-by-case basis,
Right.
but say that this is the tool moving forward that has to be used to determine whether or not it's adequate.
And there are several of these mathematical tools out there. That's the simplest one that most people can understand, since we all have fourth grade math abilities, at least I do, so that you can understand it. And that one is being tested, and it was developed by a professor in Michigan, I hope. So we're going to see what happens with that. If it is approved, or if the Supreme Court agrees that this might be a viable solution, then there will be an established law that can be worked with. Right now, there's no established law. That's our biggest problem with political extreme gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering, again, is pretty simple.
I'd just like to follow up to understand. So it sounded to me as though Stuart's describing a test of a proposed change in boundaries, whereas if you are just trying to determine whether, in fact, the current boundaries are appropriate or inappropriate or whatever, and there's a history here,
Oh, there's a long history, absolutely. The political parties have done this since Andrew Jackson, second president, whichever, fourth maybe. Yeah, it's happened. This what Michigan is using, if it's Michigan, is called the efficiency gap. That's what it's called, the efficiency gap. And again, it's pretty easy to take the total number of votes, saying how many votes were for the losing party, is their representation, or was it distorted? It's actually pretty easy to figure out. And that's a horrible explanation, I apologize. The efficiency gap is what it's called. And the boundaries are so sophisticated now that they actually can move between houses. And they do in some of these states. They move between houses to make sure that they have the voters that they want. Not the voters, or not the politicians you want, but the voters the politicians have chosen for you.
Well, and I'm remembering from when California had its redistricting commission, and they had a list of, and I cannot remember either how many, but they had a list of the kinds of criteria you should use. And they were communities of interest that shouldn't be divided, and geographic borders, and a whole list of things like that that were kind of acceptable ways of drawing lines. And I thought that was useful at the time. And in fact, one of the things I thought would be interesting to do is to look at like LA County and our 5 districts. And one of them looks to me like a bird flying. And I think it would be interesting to look at the decisions that have been made in some of those cases and see if indeed they might be geographic boundaries that make sense, or some other thing that makes sense, or it could be that it looks like they've divided things that maybe shouldn't be because it gives somebody an advantage.
And California just did pass a law to eliminate county gerrymandering in the state of California, because that is still done. Supervisory districts, city council districts are still done, can be done by the local politicians. They are not part of California's independent commission that draws our state lines. So California would be the first state that ever did this on all levels, if it goes through and if it is implemented. Anyone else?
Any other questions?
I had heard, quite surprisingly, that when it came to gerrymandering, the Democrats were more effective than the Republicans. Do you have any sense overall of which if any party is benefiting from all of this?
To answer that in a non-political way, a nonpartisan way, a lot of states have changed their colors, whether they were blue before or red before or whatever, they have flipped. And they have been that way since the census of 2010, when those maps were redrawn. And when those maps were redrawn, that's when those databases could be used by statisticians to actually figure out street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood. Before that time, it really was arbitrary. Oh yes, we knew there was a pocket of these voters here and a pocket of these voters here, a pocket of these voters here, so we'll draw that to who's ever in charge to make that effective for whichever the ruling party was. After the 2010 census, that changed everything. Those databases are incredibly sophisticated, and they've allowed this to happen. And that's why we can no longer say political gerrymandering is just the way it is. It's always been that way. The party in power should always be the party to make those decisions. With extreme gerrymandering, that means the party in power will always be the party in power. There will be no choice. North Carolina is a perfect example. The at-large election for governor elected had more Democratic votes, but yet in the state of North Carolina, those legislatures are still held 9-3, 9 Republicans to 3 Democrats, and that will not change unless those lines are changed. And that's pretty much happening in a lot of those states. And while these are the only 2 courts that are cases that are up against the Supreme Court right now, there is a stack of states that the lower courts have thrown out their maps. Wisconsin, Ohio, Texas, Alabama. There's a whole bunch of states that are just waiting, that the lower circuit courts have already thrown out their political gerrymandering maps. They're waiting to see what the decision is on whether they should move ahead, keep their maps, or appeal to the Supreme Court. And you are right when you say that the Supreme Court doesn't want to be doing this over and over again, state by state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction and jurisdiction. But the only way they're going to stop that is if they come out with a decision. Once you got something on the books, you deal with it. Once you have established law, you've got something to deal with.
I just learned this morning about somebody I had not heard of, Thomas Heffler. They said he was the Michelangelo of gerrymandering.
Is that the man that died?
The man
Yes.
that died, yes, he's a GOP strategist, and they said even though he's dead, they're still using the things that he taught them. And evidently, as I understand it, he was the one that noticed that Democrats had been doing a better job, and so he got busy and turned it into a real science.
He also set up a whole strategy, not only for gerrymandering, it was also for the court system. So he's made a step-by-step roadmap that's being used. And it's interesting that these documents have come out, I don't know if you've seen the reports, have come out on his hard drive now by his Democratic daughter. Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see what's, if anything, if that's going to make any difference at all.
And there's a new book, and I don't remember who wrote it, but Give Us the Ballot, that sounded like it was well worth looking at. And Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Spent a lot of time on gerrymandering this morning. And they talked about looking at things like in Ohio, 50% of the voters, they split 50-50, right, but the Republicans have 63% of the seats. And I think it was Indiana where it's again about 50-50 split, but 71% of the seats go to one side.
If you look at all those what are considered purple states or swing states that went one way at this last election, they are all almost 50-50, but they are controlled by gerrymandering since 2010 by the Republican Party. The Republican Party's in charge, they get to draw the maps, that's the way it is. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. The Democrats did it in Maryland, we saw it.
Well, I thought our Citizens Commission did a good job. It was interesting to watch, and the only disappointing thing for me was how few citizens came out to watch them do it, because it was a very open process, and I hope to see it happen again.
The way the system works in California, and you can help me if I'm wrong on this, is I think it takes 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 2 independent, or 2 non-party preference or independents. and any one of us can put our name in the hat. And it's drawn out arbitrarily out of a hat. And then they draw out 20 names, and then they interview you. And if you're picked, it can be you or me, can be on that commission to decide where those lines are drawn after the census in 2020 in California. It's a very interesting process. What now they're discussing is, it was pretty even, 4-4, and they're now saying that now that the non-party preference is the second largest voting bloc in California, the Democrats, the non-party preference, then the Republicans, according to the registration data in California. Should the no-party preference be given more seats at the table? So that's the discussion now. I told you the happiest time you were going to have was when you first walked into this room, and I really apologize for that. In 2016, I left everybody with a really upbeat message. My only upbeat message that I have is get everyone you know to vote. That's the only thing that matters. Every election matters. Every vote matters. And when you're voting in a primary, yes, you can vote from your heart, and that is the horse race. But when it comes to the general, you got to vote with your brain. Leave your heart beside. Vote with your brain. Thank you all very, very much.